Welcome, everyone, to another fantastic Democracy Day event. Today, we're going to be hosting Christophe Crombez, who is part of our team here at the Europe Center. My name is Grzymala-Busse. I am the director of the Europe Center. And today, he'll be talking about a really disturbing phenomenon and the rise of the far right in recent elections in Europe. So without further ado, Christophe, please.
All right, good afternoon, and welcome to this seminar. Thanks, Anna, for the introduction. Of course, it's very tough for me to talk about the rise of the far right in Europe with somebody in the audience, the chair, who knows way more about the rise of the far right than I do. But I'm going to try to do so anyway. I'm going to focus a little bit on recent elections in Europe, on the European Parliament elections, and try to say a few meaningful things about the far right. So this is sort of I'm moving my slides, but there was a problem here. So Shannon, can you move to the next slide with the outline? Or this one, but the previous one would be better. So yeah, this is sort of what I will talk about. We'll talk a little bit, make some introductory comments, look at the EP elections, their impact, then a few other comments, and depending on the time that is left and on your interests, I will talk a little bit about the elections in member states that took place recently. A couple of the slides I used at an earlier talk when I talked about the EP elections in May, so some of you may recognize some of them. So if we go back to the previous one, there's two people here that you may recognize. Does anybody know who the person on top is? They're not far-right politicians, neither of the two.
Leuven?
What?
Leuven?
No. The one on the top is Simone Veil. She was a prominent politician in France in the 1970s. She's the person who proposed a law in parliament to legalize abortion in France. And she was the first president of the directly elected European Parliament in 1979. She died a few years ago. The person at the bottom is
Roberta Metsola?
Yes, and she is the current president of the European Parliament. She has been in that position for the past 2.5 years and just got another 2.5-year term. Now, it's not really a surprise that you don't know these people. I'm sure that my students in classes here at Stanford, but also my students in Europe, and pretty much any average European would not recognize these two people. Which leads me to the next point, and that is, which are the most important elections, in my opinion, for Europe this year? And to the next slide. And I'm not the only person I notice who thinks that. A couple of weeks ago, there was a Lithuanian ambassador who was here visiting, and she made the exact same point. So if we go to the next slide, we can see what is, I think, the most important election for Europe this year. What is happening here today? And you see, of course, one of the candidates there embracing one of his idols, or maybe his foremost idol, and knocking over in the process a number of organizations that are the result of American-European cooperation since World War II. And some of the then government leaders, maybe not coincidentally, two women. So anyway, and this sort of reflects one of today's candidates' attitude towards Europe, at least as the way it is perceived, and probably what is in store for Europe in the next few years, in the case this candidate were to win. Now, to make another connection with US elections and with, I guess, the purpose of this whole student project, Democracy Day, I would like to talk a little bit, say a few words about the youth vote. And to do that, I would like to move to the next slide, which may be something that at first sight has nothing to do with the youth vote. And these are election results in my native home country. A few weeks ago, in the provincial elections, there were provincial and municipal elections in Belgium in about 4 weeks ago, October 9. This was the results, and comparison that is made is with the regional elections that took place just a few months ago in June. Now, what was the major change in, not in the support of the different parties, but what was sort of one institutional change that Belgium came up with, or at least the northern part, Flanders, they introduced something for the first time in Belgian history, and Belgium goes back to 1830, so almost 200 years. What did they do? Any ideas? This shows how important Belgium is, of course, that everybody is thinking about this. They abolished something in Flanders. And as politicians do, sometimes they abolish one thing or another without thinking about the consequences. They abolished compulsory voting in Flanders for the first time ever. And this is how the election results then in provincial elections compared with the election result in June. What is the major difference? Which party benefited the most? Well, I myself, and pretty much any political scientist, could have told you this, but in Belgium, this was the big surprise of election night. Here, this party did very well. CD&V, and what is CD&V? Well, what does the C and the D stand for in Flanders? The Christian Democratic Party. They got almost 20%, a result that they had not had in 10 years or something like that, became the second party, whereas in most of the recent elections, they always got around 13, 12, 14%. Now, this is not only because of the youth vote, of course, or the absence thereof. Who votes for the Christian Democrats? Old people tend to vote for the Christian Democrats. And just like in any other country, surprise, surprise, in Belgium, they turned out in higher numbers than younger people. If I look at my parents, they were there standing in line at 8 a.m. when polls opened together with a whole bunch of other 85-year-olds and waiting to cast their ballot. I was in Belgium at that time. I was teaching a class then, and I told my students, you guys should go and vote, because your generation tends not to vote. They were surprised. Now, granted, they were economic students, not political science students, but still. So this shows how election results change if certain groups stay home. The other thing that happened, and maybe not so much because of younger voters staying home, but more disinterested voters. This is the far right, and this is the far left. Both of these parties lost quite a bit compared to the last election in June, where voting was mandatory. So your vote matters. If I can, of course, you guys wouldn't be here if you weren't interested in politics, so you already voted. But anyway, an illustration of the importance of voting, also for younger people. I have a couple of slides also about youth vote in Flanders. Not very scientific. And this was a poll organized by students at the university that I teach at in Belgium, in Leuven. This is how in June, according to them, I have no idea how accurate their polling techniques were. This is how people in the social sciences, and social sciences in Leuven includes political science, international relations, and sociology. This is how they voted, and a lot of other departments or faculties as well. So how did they vote? They voted for the left. Just like I would think, and most people would expect people here to vote, even though I've never seen a poll of political science students. But if you add the socialists, the Greens, and the far left here, you get to more than 50%. Now, this figure also illustrates something that happened in Belgian politics, not just for younger voters, but in general, and in European elections in general. Who was one of the big losers in the European elections in June and in a lot of national elections on the left? Who lost? The Greens. People have not been paying much attention to climate change and all these things in the past few months. They've been focused on other things. So there was a big shift from the Greens to the Social Democrats, who came up with a younger new leader. I also have the figures for the economics department or the economic students, and they vote quite a bit differently. On the next slide, this is the economics department. They vote for the center right, the main party on the center right, that in the general population got about a quarter of the vote. They got more than half of the vote. Now, when I was a student there, an undergrad in the 1980s, that was pretty much also the case. The parties were different, but most people voted for the center right. They won a lot, the main party, at the expense of whom? Well, the other big loser in not just the Belgian elections, but the European elections. The other big loser being on the center, in the center right, the liberals. Okay. So anyway, that's just a few things I wanted to point out about the youth vote without going into too much of a thorough analysis. What about the right then? What about the far right and how the far right has been doing in general? Well, one of the main points I made in May, before the European elections, and one of the main points that I want to make again, is that if you listen to the news, if you read the papers, or you go online, you watch the evening news in Europe, or the news about Europe here, it's quite easy to get the impression that the right is always winning, and the far right is winning and winning and winning, and Europe is basically going down the drain. There's a takeover of these anti-democratic parties and so on. Now, there is some truth to it. I think Anna showed figures a few days ago, on Thursday or so, I believe, that show that if you go back all the way, 3 decades or 4 decades or so, you can see that the far right has, on average, and been gaining, and that gain has been quite steady. Now, that does not mean that the far right has always won. There has been some downs, and definitely if you focus on individual countries, there have been big movements in the support for the far right. If I look again at my own home country in Belgium, the best result that the far right got so far was not in October or not in June. It was in 2004, 20 years ago. So it's not always the case that the far right does very well. And even if they do very well, they do not take over. And the reality is a lot more nuanced. Now, on the next slide, there's a few newspaper headlines from Politico or from NPR or from websites, not necessarily newspapers, and The Guardian. They talk focusing on national elections in Europe and on European Parliament elections. They talk about an implosion of the EU, a populist takeover in Croatia. If you look at the polls or the election results, the populists got, if I'm not mistaken, a little bit more than 10%, but a populist takeover nonetheless, according to the paper. Same thing in Portugal. How dangerous is the far right, and so on. Even on the next slide, I have, that was the day I gave my talk here in May, I went to the Politico website, and these were the first articles that Politico had about the EU. Von der Leyen opens the door to the hard right. This will come back later in the talk. Portugal's far right doesn't like vaccines. The Grand Duchy, Luxembourg, borderlands are witnessing a gain for the far right. If you look at the Luxembourg elections, in the last election about a year ago in October, the far right is like the 4th, 5th party or so and has 10% of the vote, but nonetheless, this is what Politico chooses to focus on. Now, what happened then in the end in the European Parliament elections? You can go to the next slide. Well, obviously, it did not lead to a far-right takeover. I have a slide with the election results, but the next one, the one after this, it did not lead to a far-right takeover. We'll go back to the text in a second. This is what the chamber looks like now. And if you were to compare this with the composition of the European Parliament prior to the election in June, it wouldn't be all that much different. Now, on the right, all these blue and black colors, those are the right. And the light blue is the center right, the main party in the European Parliament, the largest one for the past 25 years, the European People's Party, the Christian Democrats and moderate conservatives. Now, they have gained a little bit, well, a bit under 50 seats if you add everything up. But okay, 50 seats, let's say it's even 50 seats. That's a lot of seats, but this is in a parliament of 720 members, so you get to 6-7%, and that's a sort of a maximalistic interpretation. Now, does that mean they're taking over the European Parliament? No. If you add all the far-right members up, then you get to a bit more than 25% of the seats, 27 or whatever, somewhere in that vicinity. So, okay, it's a progression, but they're not taking over. And the European Parliament, just like most countries in the EU, is elected based on proportional representation. They also internally function, and we'll talk about it in a second, sort of with proportional representation ideas in mind. So it's not the case that you easily get in the European Parliament one party that dominates, and then they appoint all the chairmanships and so on, as is the case in the US Congress. No, that is not the case. So the far right together has, I think, about 180 seats now, 180, 190 out of 200, out of 720. They gained, but not enough to take over. If you look at EPP, they also gained about 10 seats. They now have, 187 or 88. Then the yellow is the Liberals. They lost. They went from more than 100, 108 or something, down to 77. So they lost more than 30 seats. If you only have 100, and that's quite a big loss. I talk to these people quite regularly. That means that they have to get rid of a good part of their staff. Very painful also for them as a group, and it makes their function quite a bit harder. The socialists sort of lost a little bit, but not very much. They had 136 seats, that's the red. Then the Greens also lost. They lost about 20 seats, down to 53. And the far left actually gained the number of seats. They got to 46, but they gained to some extent because one party that is not all that small, in not all that small a country, joined them. The Cinque Stelle movement in Italy, they joined the far left, which for them was enough of an increase in seats to come out on a positive note out of this election. So a few more remarks. Now, talking about the far right again, even if we say, well, 180, 190 seats, that's about as much as the EPP, the largest party. Well, yes, that's true. But the far right, luckily, you could say, is usually not all that united. Not a surprise, really. It's not a surprise, I would think, that German nationalists don't get along with Italian nationalists or with Polish nationalists and so on. So that is also the case in the European Parliament. The far right is split over different groups. You have a new group, the Europe of Sovereign Nations, and the ESN. They have 25 seats. Then the Patriots for Europe, that's Viktor Orban and a number of others, they have 84 seats. Then there's another group, the European Conservatives and Reformists. They have 78 groups, but they're already you can argue whether they're all far right. Some of them are not far right. They are conservatives that end up in that group because there's already a Christian Democratic Party in their country, and that Christian Democratic Party doesn't want them to be in the Christian Democratic group also, and internal reasons. That's why some of these conservative groups or parties end up in that conservative group, together with people who are usually considered to be in the far right. The ECR group is also the group of the Polish party that was in the Law and Justice Party, that was in charge in Poland for 8 years until last year, until they lost the election last year. And of course, maybe the most talked about politician of the past year or so in Italy, in Europe, and the leader of the Italian government, Meloni, who has been, Giorgia Meloni, who has been sort of trying to sort of play both sides and try to be close to the Christian Democrats to get things done for Italy and to get all kinds of interesting jobs in the European Commission, in the European Parliament. We'll get to that in a second. And at the same time, she has tried to sort of make sure that she doesn't get any competition to her right in Italy. And maybe she's waiting to see what will happen in the US and in other countries. And they will decide then how far to the right or how close to the center she will position herself. I almost make it seem like she doesn't have any principles. Who knows? I wouldn't want to say that about any politician, of course, make such an accusation. But anyway, so the far right, luckily, is not all that united usually. So on their own, they're not going to be able to have an impact on what the European Parliament is going to do. Now, what has been the impact of this election? And it's something that was kind of expected. Of course, it still remains to be seen what the policy impact will be. But in the previous parliament, on some more social issues like immigration, like the environment, and so on, the liberals, the yellow group there, they sided very often with the left. And if a few people stayed home and maybe a few people on the left of the European People's Party voted with them, they could get a majority. So they managed to pass environmental legislation and so on. Now that coalition does not get even close to a majority anymore. They would need another, whatever, 50 members or so to join them to pass legislation with a coalition on the left. So that is not going to happen in the next 5 years. So that means, or in other words, what happened is that the median voter in the European Parliament moved from Renew Europe, the liberal group, to the EPP, the Christian Democrats, the largest group. That also, of course, implies then that something could happen that did not happen very often in the previous parliament, and that is that the EPP could pass legislation together with all the parties on the right. But as I already mentioned, all these parties on the right, they're not all that united. So that's not very likely to happen very often. Plus, in the EPP too, there are some people who are a little bit closer to the left, or even parties in the EPP that have labor unions or are closely connected to labor unions. They're not going to go and vote all kinds of important laws with the far right. So that coalition, the EPP far right, is not likely to come about very often. And to make it somewhat workable, they would also need to have support from the liberals. Now, the liberals, on economic issues, they're quite far to the right, or a lot of them. There are a lot of libertarians there, or some at least. So you could say on economic issues, they're going to form more coalitions on the right. But that's not quite what we can expect either. Why? Because these far-right parties, and a lot of these far-right politicians, they're called far-right politicians, but on economic issues, they're actually not so much to the right. A lot of these far-right parties in Europe, in France, in Belgium, they've moved to the left on economic issues, on things like force protectionism and so on, free trade, but also on other issues like the pension, the retirement age, and stuff like that. They have realized, these parties, maybe something that the Republican Party has not realized or is unable to act on, given that they depend on billionaires, basically. But they have realized, these far-right parties, our voters are usually not all that rich, and they would benefit from things like more generous pension benefits, something that, for example, also in Poland, the previous government realized, and then of course you can hand out money and to make sure to buy votes, almost, especially if you do it just before the election. Viktor Orban is also in Hungary, has also realized that. So also on economic issues, it's not all that likely that the coalition on the right is going to form. So the most likely coalition of parties, of groups, that is still going to be setting policy in the EU is going to be the same as before. The three large groups and the three large political families that have been around in a lot of countries since the 19th century, and the Christian Democrats or conservatives, the Social Democrats and the Liberal Democrats, they still have a large majority, and they will still need to work together to set policy on a lot of issues. Okay? So that's some of the things I wanted to say. Maybe now that you can sort of check my slides, that we can go back 2 slides, maybe go back first 2 slides to see what the, yes, here. So the far right won, but the EU did not implode. It's still around as far as I know. Voters remain in favor of the EU and EU membership. An illustration is the next slide. I talk a little bit about how many seats parties won and lost. This shows that a large majority of people still think that the EU benefits for their member state. Let's see. Then the following slide is the one I've been showing for a while, and then the next one. The impact on EU policies. I talked about this, but these are some of the achievements, some of the things that the previous parliament achieved. Not much, maybe no need to talk about that. Then most of the next slide, and most of these laws were passed by a super grand coalition. So the 3 parties that we talked about, and the Greens very often also are making it a super grand coalition. The center left sometimes formed on a bunch of issues like environment, justice and home affairs and civil liberties, that includes immigration and a bunch of other issues. On some other issues like agriculture and fisheries, sometimes a center-right coalition formed together with the liberals then. Next slide, and that's a bit looking looking forward a little bit. Most impacted will be issues decided by the center left in the past, but the EU already passed a lot of legislation, or some legislation, on migration and the environment. So in any case, there was not much expected to be passed anytime soon. Actually, they did pass a deal on migration just before the elections, because they were expecting the far right to do better. I mentioned that the EPP far-right coalition could be difficult to achieve, so the super grand coalition probably would stay in power. Then I have a couple of slides about not the impact on policies, but on politics, on the functioning of the European Parliament, the different institutions. So if you look at the functioning of the European Parliament, I mentioned a few of the coalitions that could form. Most of the time, we're still going to have a grand coalition, probably. The left coalition doesn't get close to a majority anymore. And you could say that the EPP is definitely in a stronger position today than it was before. Next slide, please. One of the consequences already, if we look at what they have done, sort of getting organized for the new term in the European Parliament, Metsola, the person I showed very early on, she's been re-elected as EP president for another 2.5 years. They split the 5-year terms in 2. And then maybe something interesting to see, what has happened with so dividing all the other spoils and all the chairmanships and so on. Well, there are 24 main committees in the European Parliament, and usually they're sort of awarded to the different groups on a proportional basis using the Don system. But what do you see here? What have they done? They've sort of stuck to that, but they have excluded the parties on the far right to a large extent. Not completely, but they have done proportional representation as far as the internal organization of the European Parliament is concerned, but marginalizing the far right. And maybe, I mean, if you go, for example, if you attended Anna's talk on Thursday, one of the things that Anna said, and one of the points sometimes made by politicians also, is that the way to beat the far right is to exclude them, is to say, well, I don't want to put words into into Anna's mouth. I mean, she can add to it if I don't characterize it very well, but to sort of erect what they have done in Belgium and in France for a long time, a cordon sanitaire, and say, we're not going to cooperate with you. And of course, this is democracy and based on majority rule, also for the internal organization of the European Parliament. So the other parties can get together and say, well, we're going to divide the chairmanships proportionally amongst ourselves, but not with you guys, because you're a threat to democracy or whatever the reason may be. They could also just, I mean, the three large parties, the Social Democrats, the Christian Democrats, and the Liberal Democrats, they could also say the three of us are going to divide everything. And they have a majority, so they could do that, but they don't. So the result is you get a roughly proportional representation of the chairmanships. The EPP gets a disproportionate share. And then the ECR, that's the group where Meloni's party is in, they sort of get treated as a normal party, maybe not for very long, we'll see. But it's also interesting to see who gets the chairmanships from within that group. There's a representative from a Belgian party, which is a conservative party that is not really a far-right party, and that's the main party on the center-right, that is not in the EPP because the Christian Democrats don't want them there. Then you have a representative from the Czech party that is in the ECR. The Czech party that is in the ECR was actually the party that ran as part of a larger coalition in the last Czech elections against a populist leader, and managed to get him out of power. And then there is one guy that's probably most people would, or from a party that most people would characterize as far right, a Polish representative. He got a chairmanship. He got the chairmanship for petitions. I don't know exactly what they do, but my guess is it's not the most important chairmanship to get petitions. I would not have, I don't know, of course. I'm not a member of the European Parliament. I would probably not have wanted that position. Okay, next slide. All right. Okay. Now, the EP elections also have an impact on other institutions. The Commission is appointed based on the outcome of the European Parliament elections and the result of the fact that the EPP stayed by far the largest party is that Ursula von der Leyen, German Christian Democrat, she got renominated and reappointed as Commission President. So she gets a second 5-year term. Maybe her position is strengthened now because the EPP did better, and it's in the center again, also the median in the European Parliament. On the other hand, she has to balance a little bit the different interests. There is also now a member of the ECR, Meloni's group, and in fact, Meloni's party in the Commission. And he got a relatively important position. He's one of the vice presidents. He has responsibility for health and a few other things, maybe not the most important thing. But some people are very upset about that, and that she shouldn't have given him any, she should have put him in charge of something that was given a few years ago to another commissioner. She should have put him in charge of multilingualism. would have been maybe a good thing. But anyway, some people are upset about that, but there is now a member of the ECR in there. And of course, there's a member of the PFE, the Patriots for Europe, and who is the main guy in the group, or one of the main parties, not the only one, not the largest one. But a lot of people would associate the Patriots for Europe with Orban. And so the Orban's party has a majority in parliament. So they lead the government. All the government ministers are of that party pretty much. So they send somebody to the Commission. So there are two far-right members now in the European Commission, 2 out of 27. The EPP now pretty much has a majority. Okay, so you could say, well, you make it seem like it doesn't have all that much impact on the internal functioning of the European Parliament. The Commission, okay, now there's 2 far-right members in there out of 27, not such a big deal. But the papers in Europe a couple of weeks ago, a lot of papers published this picture or a variation of it. Does anybody know what this picture is about and who is in the picture? Who's the person here?
Maloney.
Maloney, and this is Ursula von der Leyen. So she's been criticized for being too nice to the right, and maybe she is to the far right. And this has been taken as seen as some evidence of that. What happened at one of the meetings of the European Council a few weeks ago? The heads of state and government in the EU, they talked about what issue? Migration, because even though I said earlier, they passed the migration deal this spring, so most people thought they're not going to talk about this anymore in the next few months or so. A whole bunch of countries isn't happy. They want to reinstate border controls within the EU, unless external border controls are strengthened. So who did Ursula von der Leyen meet with to sort of prepare her meeting? Maloney. Who's this guy? Orban. Who's the guy next to Maloney? Maybe not so well known. Also somebody of the far right, you could say. The new Prime Minister of the Netherlands, Schoof, who doesn't belong to any party, but he was chosen by Geert Wilders, who's the leader of the main far-right party in the Netherlands, the party that basically came in first at the European election. The one guy there that most people would not consider as a far-right, but of course he cares about migration policy. He has the Greek flag in front of him, and he's the Prime Minister of Greece. Okay, next slide. So anyway, the point of this picture was that to some extent you have a whole bunch of countries, or some countries at least, we'll see exactly how many, that have a far here, I guess, that have a far-right leader. So Ursula von der Leyen cannot avoid talking to them, I would say. And maybe she talks to them too much sometimes, or at least to the taste of some people. The European Council, the European Parliament elections don't really have much of an impact on the European Council, who is in the meeting of heads of state and government. That's determined by member state elections. If you see there are 3 leaders now of the far right. Italy, the Czech, the Czech leader is a leader who beats the populist leader, but he also belongs to the ECR. And of course you have Orban, but there is also at least one independent that most people would consider as the leader of a populist party, and that is in Slovakia, where the party that used to be a social democratic party became more and more populist and anti-immigrant. You have also the Dutch leader, who does not belong to any party, but his government includes a populist party, which is also true in Croatia and Finland. And then you have one government in Sweden that is supported by a far-right party. So the far right has a number of governments where it has some influence. What did I say? A total of 7 governments, you could say, out of 27. These 3 people I put on a slide together here because they're the 3 leaders of the of government that belong to the far right, or to the extent that you, this is the Slovak guy, to the extent you consider him far right. Now, the next slide, maybe I have one more point I want to make, and then we can, if you want to, talk about member state elections. But and I would rather maybe open it up for questions, since we will only have like 15 minutes left or so. I show this slide, these 2 people here, and then formulate a few comments. Why would I show these 2 people? Who are these 2 people?
Le Pen's.
Yeah, this is the father and daughter Le Pen, Marine Le Pen and Jean-Marie Le Pen. I showed that also to make a point that I maybe alluded to earlier, and that is that these far-right parties, that's true for the French Rassemblement National now, they're very popular these days, but they have been around for a long time. This guy started that party in the 80s, even in the late 70s. He made it to the 2nd round in the presidential race in 2002 already, 22 years ago. So in the next slide, I just make the point that populist parties have had successes going way back. If you read sometimes you read articles in US papers, they would make it seem like Trump started all this, and that is of course not the case. He's not that well organized, I would say. In some countries, I didn't talk much about it, even though I alluded to that. In some countries, the far right, even today, doesn't really get more than 10% or so. Even in countries where they do well, like in Germany, and they only get 14 or 16% or so. You have different kinds of far-right parties on the left and the right, different geographical distribution and so on. Sometimes mainstream parties turn into far-right parties. Sometimes you have new parties popping up on the far left, far right. And their positions have evolved, less opposed to the EU, because they realized after Brexit, people don't really want to go that route. They've moved to the left economically. Then the last slide with text. It's not been going up steadily, their support. I mentioned that. I mean, it's been going up in general, but not at every single election. They don't always win. And I think Anna also made this point here. They don't always win. In some countries that they get to this tipping point, I would say Hungary has gotten there, where it's almost impossible for an opposition party to win an election there. Even though today, I believe, I read there's for the first time, there's a poll in Hungary that shows that Orban's party would not be the first party, but a new party that was put together that has been rising in the polls. So who knows, maybe there is a little bit of hope for Hungary. But some of them do get thrown out of office. They don't always win. And that also means for parties that are in office. And that brings me to the last slide I want to show. These 2 guys, they were thrown out of office. Polish leader Kaczynski and his party. And then I also have a picture of a populist left leader who was thrown out of office after a bit more than a term in Greece, Tsipras. Now, Anna talked a little bit about what makes populist parties lose. I think Anna mentioned a few things: turnout, mobilizing people. I don't know whether I'm summarizing it well. Of course, it's also hard to govern, as some of these leaders are not all that competent when they're in power. And if they're isolated, it also makes it hard for them to get anywhere. I would add one thing maybe to it, and that maybe Anna talked a little bit about that on Thursday also, is that what some people have managed to do, like in the Czech Republic or like in Poland, is to get rid of their populist leaders by all uniting. by not, I mean, if the different other parties are fighting each other, or different factions within a party are debating or arguing about how far left they should be, and pointing fingers at other parties or other factions that are not enough to the left or whatever in their opinion, that makes beating a populist party, of course, a lot harder. That's the last thing maybe I would like to say. And we have, I guess, about 10, 15 minutes for questions.
Thank you so much. Great, so I will take any questions.
Thank you so much for being here. So you mentioned earlier that the reason why the far-right ideology is not fully disseminated well and does not result in the voter base voting for them, essentially there's no cohesion among the leaders of the far-right party leaders, right? But I struggle to understand why that is the case in Europe. Couldn't these savvy politicians find a location somewhere in Budapest or Paris and have an actual chat about how they should be advancing that interest? So that'll be one. Two is there anything systematically very different among Europeans versus the Americans with respect to far-right beliefs, that to the point where they're not willing to vote alongside with far-right politicians that are increasingly popular, maybe in several democratic states, including, say, the US or maybe Indonesia, India, and Europe? So that'll be my two questions for you.
Okay, so on the last point, I'm not sure that I know exactly what you are trying to get at, but so are there some type of, are there differences? Are there types of leaders or policies that people in Europe wouldn't vote for? Is that the question? Or,
I think it's more about how maybe in other countries, people tend to be swayed much more instinctively to far-right leaders and politicians, that they vote alongside with the agenda that they propose. Versus you mentioned in Europe, I think there's no particular changes in the European Parliament despite all the increasing nature of far-right agenda, for example. Is there anything innate within European culture maybe, or the people, that they don't follow that?
I would like to say that this is the case, but I don't know. I don't think so. Well, so, but are you talking about like personalities? Are you?
I'm not sure.
Mentioning
I'm
that
not entirely sure.
and so on is important. I would like to think that there are countries where people would not vote for a character like Trump, for example. But even though there's nobody leading or as successful or getting as high a percentage of the vote, I would say, who can sort of be compared as a leader and with his personal characteristics and so on to Trump in Europe, for example. But I wouldn't go as far as saying that this would never happen in a European country. There are politicians who have said things like that in the past and have been shown wrong. Just as a small illustration, in the 1990s, the far right was already doing quite well in Belgium, in Flanders, the Dutch-speaking part of Belgium. I remember there were people, political scientists in the Netherlands, journalists who were writing articles about why the far right would never do well in the Netherlands. What was different between Flanders and the Netherlands, even though we speak the same language? Of course, now the far right is doing way better in the Netherlands. So I would not go as far as to say that like a figure like Trump, for example, or whatever, or the Argentinian president would never rise to power anywhere in Europe. And then the first point, why do they not get along? Well, I mean, one thing is what I mentioned earlier. I mean, they're all very nationalistic, and the interests of Hungary are not always the same as the interests of Greece or something like that, or well, Greece doesn't have a far right either, but Italy, or I don't know. And so I can see that there's disagreements because of that. Now, all of these people also like to think of themselves as strong leaders, and they have a big ego, and it's all about them. The strong leader plays a big role in populist parties. So it's not so easy for these people to share a platform with others. Of course, these people sit together, and they do, but they don't manage to unite usually. And every so often there's a story, oh, they're going to unite and so on. It never really happens.
So I've got a quick question about, so in the abstract that was released with this event, there was mention of the kind of impact on European integration resulting from the rise of the far left. And I was wondering, so my research is in the European values crisis and the notion of existential threats and kind of whether the EU will actually implode. So I like the fact that you included one of the kind of chaos related headlines. And so one of the big concerns is the notion of the lack of cohesion between member states in the European Union and the potential resulting lack of integration that this could lead to. And so I was wondering if you could speak to essentially this rise of the far right and the potential impact on the lack of integration. Is there such a thing? Do you consider it a threat to the EU's existence? Anything to that effect? Thank you.
I would say a couple of things. First, I would say something that I mentioned in the talk also, that most of these far-right parties have moderated their views about the EU, and they have realized we don't get anywhere if we say we're going to leave the euro or we're going to leave the European Union or something like that. Even in Hungary or in Poland, most of the people are, large majorities of voters are in favor of the EU. So they don't do that anymore. Most of these far-right parties that have had some success electorally. So that's one thing. The other thing, of course, is that they don't sort of have a very high opinion of a federal Europe. They sort of, to the extent that they talk about European cooperation, they talk about more sort of an intergovernmental form of cooperation between sovereign states, so where everybody maintains their veto power. Of course, if you do that, you don't get very far in European integration. So my guess is that, given that there's a whole bunch of these countries now with parties of that nature that are part of the government, at least, that there's not going to be major steps towards further integration. And that maybe some of the things that were achieved are going to maybe not unravel, but at least maybe take a step back, like free movement or something like that. On the other hand, there are big challenges. Would be my third point. There are big challenges today, challenges that were not there, or I should rephrase it, that major political leaders were not focusing on 5 or 10 or 20 years ago, defense policy and so on, also the borders. And so that would create an opportunity to do something. And on the far right also there, and that also goes back to the previous point, the far right is also not always united in terms of policies. And if you talk about Russia, you talk about Ukraine, far-right parties don't all agree with that, with each other on that. Some are more on the Ukrainian side, like the Polish leaders, like to a large extent Meloni in Italy. Some others, like Orban or Slovakia, they're more friendly to Russia. So, but to the extent, you could imagine a situation where the EU realizes we need to do more on defense, and that maybe Orban doesn't create too much problem, or he can be bought off as he usually is by giving him a few more billions for his friends or something like that. You could imagine that some steps would be taken in that area or in some other areas. So now I've given 3 parts to an answer, which creates a global answer that is always right.
Well, I'm Juliana Christine. I'm Belgian, so I'm really happy to be here. I'm from Wallonia, so a little bit different from Flanders. And I was wondering, because you mentioned that Flanders now is optional for voting. So I was wondering, how different do you believe that it is, like the optional voting there and in the US? And how do you believe that the US elections today will affect the EU?
Okay, so these are, I guess, if I understand correctly, 2 very different questions.
Yes.
So the first part, how is it going to affect, or what is different?
Like how different it is, like on your perspective, like you're voting like in the US and in like Belgium now, or even in the EU, especially regarding like optional voting and getting people to actually vote.
Well, I would say maybe a couple of things. One thing that was clear in Flanders, where they abolished compulsory voting, is they just abolished it because there was one party that was part of the government last time, the Liberal Party, and they wanted this because they want people to be free, and this was such a burden for people, blah, blah, blah. So they abolished it to please that party. But they didn't give it any second thoughts. So what I mean is a lot of politicians and journalists were surprised that the participation rate went from 92% or so to, I think, 65. And they said, oh, this is such a huge drop in just one election. Well, maybe that's true, but one thing was that nobody did an effort to have people turn out. So political parties just thought, okay, this is going to go down from 92 to 85 or something like that. They didn't do any effort to urge their voters to go out because they're not used to it and so on. And they were surprised by the results. So my guess is that that will change in the future, and that they will do more of an effort to turn out the vote, to turn out their vote. So that's one thing about the first question. The second question, how does it have an impact? I started out by saying I think it's the most important election. Well, I think in a number of ways. First of all, in terms of security and defense policy, I think Trump has made it no secret that he doesn't like NATO. And they've made it more difficult for him to withdraw from NATO, the US Congress did. But he could follow a strategy that he followed, for example, with the World Trade Organization. If you stop really being involved and you don't appoint a bunch of people like an ambassador or whatever, you withdraw some troops, you make it clear that you don't care, you give Vladimir Putin everything he wants, then effectively you even if you don't kill NATO, you lead it towards its deathbed, basically. So that basically means that the EU countries will take more responsibility and will, in terms of defense policy, probably they will have to work together more. So that would be an important impact there. Also, of course, for Ukraine and what will happen there. And also, I would say for the prospects of the far right, I'm sure that people like Orban, but also Meloni and so on, they will feel emboldened if Trump wins here. And for Meloni, maybe that may be enough to move away from the center and move further to the right and try to be nice to try to flatter Trump and hope that she gets something out of that. So I think those are some of the ways that it could have a big impact. And yeah, I think for Europe to have to focus so much on defense policy, it's a very drastic change with what it has been doing throughout my lifetime, basically. So I think it wouldn't be all that easy, especially with an aggressor on the sidelines in the East.
Well, that's extremely cheerful. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Christophe, for the presentation. And please join us at future events at the Europe Center. We have a minor, we have undergraduate research grants, we have internships, and a whole bunch of speakers. So we'd love to see you. Thank you very much.